Class 5 Chapter 5 The Structural Model of Tourist Behavior. The structuralist model of tourist behavior sees tourism more as a product of social structure than individual choice. Instead of making its prime unit of analysis the individual tourist and the influences at work on him or her, it takes society and stratified group hierarchies within society as the main focus. It conceives of the individual as enmeshed, albeit unconsciously, in a web of societal forces which mold and limit opportunities of thought and action, the result of which is to produce collective tourism tastes and habits which will vary, not because of freely made, individual choices, but due to the differing location of individuals in social and societal networks. The strands of the social web which constrain and mold individual behavior are composed of two interrelated fabrics, ideology and cultural representation. The structuralist position conceptualizes tourist behavior as a product of the distribution of ideologies which circulate within society but reach different social groups within it at different levels of intensity and repetitive emphasis, are transmitted through communicative networks of cultural representation operating through institutional mechanisms including the family, education, occupation and the media, are adopted differentially as implicit rules of behavior by groups who have absorbed the ideologies through the mechanisms of cultural representation. Two notions are central to this analysis, ideology and cultural representation, which are, in reality, closely related. Ideology. There is a vast literature on ideology and it has been used as a framework for analysis of many cultural forms, including religion, politics and leisure behavior. In its broadest sense, ideology refers to systems of ideas circulating within social systems which come to act as the implicit basis of behavior onto which underpin natural behavior. Another way of putting this is that tourism both as general practice and in its particular manifestations is not a natural activity but a constructed form which is socially induced within ideology, and then enters the domain of private motivation via mechanisms that are partly concealed by history because the individual rarely knows the origin of the ideas which she or he has internalized as normal behavior. Some social analysts see tourism as a single ideological system which is particularly influenced and promoted by international capitalism whose effects include the commoditization and appropriation of subordinate cultures, cultural dependency and domination, in effect, imperialism by peaceful means. This view goes all the way back to Marx, who saw ideology as an instrument by which powerful economic interest groups and political elites, big business and capitalistic states, control and influence subordinate populations for their own ends. In weaker versions of ideological system, but as a field constituted by a number of separate ideological elements, circulating among tourist populations, which may be general ones, travel broadens the mind, everyone needs a holiday, or specific, Italy is a great cultural center, the Seychelles is an earthly paradise. Both approaches to ideology recognize that tourism is shaped by social forces and that motivation for recreational travel, or lack of it, is never purely a matter of personal choice, though it always seemed to be, but a function of the power of socially derived ideologies and the vocabularies of motives successful ideologies tend to produce in the minds and actions of individuals, including their images of, and feelings for, places and tourist activities. Tourists may think they choose, in reality they are, to a degree, chosen by ideologies circulating within their social networks. Once tourist ideologies have gained acceptance, those who embrace them are unaware of their origins and act on them as natural facts of life. Ideologies are visible at their birth and later when challenged and contested by different ones. Ideologies are never a static set of permanent ideas. They change, rise and fall. They are most visible at movements of transition because it is then that people see them for what they are, contingent ideas rather than immutable facts of life. For example, the ideology of sun, sea and sand tourism was until recently accepted as natural and virtually synonymous with the summer holiday itself, but now that it is being attacked by health critics, it is seen as just one form of tourism which came about at a particular historical moment, in the 1920s, which may eventually disappear, like religious pilgrimages in England which were thriving in the Middle Ages. To illustrate these ideas we will look at two tourism ideologies to illustrate their social origins, Neoclassicism and Romanticism. Neoclassicism, this cult of classical antiquity, was an explicit, and remains a major implicit, ideological influence on tourism. It derived from the Renaissance, part of which was the rediscovery of pagan pasts and the civilizations of Greece and Rome by educated elite. Later classical studies were institutionalized in elite educational institutions, particularly in public schools, universities, and the tourism form known as the Grand Tour, in which the sons of aristocrats and gentry went abroad, with Italy as their ultimate goal, to learn to be cultivated gentlemen and to prepare them for diplomatic and military jobs. Knowing Latin and Greek language and culture became a badge of class membership. Oxford and Cambridge only abolished Latin as a compulsory subject in the 1960s, and its decline in public schools followed. Neoclassicism was, in short, a class-specific ideology in its origins. Classical travel became associated with the collection of curios and objects of virtue, rare and valuable works of art, which found their way into country houses built by aristocrats and their emulators, industrial millionaires in the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, the ideology of neoclassicism still unconsciously motivates travel to Italy, Greece and other places, and also visits to museums, but it is a more powerful force with education groups than others, as it always was. Romanticism developed between about 1750 and 1850, initially among middle-class intellectuals and later more widely, since which it has come down in a watered-down form to a mass, international audience. It was never a homogeneous movement but rather a number of aesthetic tastes in literature, art, philosophy and, not least, travel. Among the main ideological features of Romanticism disseminated by its prime figures, who included Rousseau in Switzerland, poets Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley and Keats in England, Heine in Germany, was reverence for nature, belief in the innate virtue of simple people in rural locations, Rousseau's noble savages, the belief that passion and feelings were more important than intellect, preeminent belief in individual rather than conventional behavior, and a great desire for travel to exotic, wild or unspoiled scenery. Landscape was a key element. Two important components of romantic responses to landscape were the concepts of the picturesque and the sublime. The picturesque was the idea that favored travel destinations that produced views that made attractive pictures, which led to modern idea of the scenic photostop and the room with a view. Picturesque scenes were thought to include old ruins, pleasing effects of light and shadow, winding rivers and streams, moonlight on water, and peasant scenes of rural life and character. The sublime was the ideology of regarding landscapes, and other phenomena, which produced feelings of awe and terror, cliffs, roaring torrents, waterfalls etc., as grand and spiritually elevating, which, among other things, made people cease to regard mountainous regions as barbarous and repulsive and come to see them as uplifting. The Alps became fashionable in the early 19th century, and mountaineering was a post-romantic pastime which developed, mainly among university-educated young men, from the 1860s onwards. Cultural representation. The systems of ideas we have termed ideology have no power unless they are conveyed in some material form to the people they later influence. The mechanisms for such transmission are cultural representations, which may be seen as images, verbal and pictorial, carried or mediated institutionally. The main institutional transmission mechanisms are the family, to a lesser extent occupational life, and, very important, the mass media. Every society exposes its members to a complex range of communication, particularly technologically advanced societies which now utilize a staggering variety of media to bombard their populations with a daily deluge of messages. Cultural representation is a name given to the immense range of mediated messages. The family and the education system are particularly powerful vehicles of cultural representation and thus ideologies. Cultural representation gives people ideas of how things were, how things are, and how things should be. It provides ideas about places, history, geography, and not least, normative ideas as to how one should behave, including judgments of good taste and how one should spend one's leisure. Tourism ideology occurs widely in cultural representation.